The morning of December 7th, 1941, did not feel like the end of the world. In fact, it felt like the very definition of peace because it was a Sunday in paradise, and the island of Oahu was waking up to a sky so blue it looked like a painting, with the gentle trade winds rustling the palm trees and the smell of roasting coffee and frying bacon wafting from the mess halls of the greatest naval fleet the world had ever seen. On the decks of the battleships lined up in a neat, orderly row along Ford Island, young sailors were shaking off the drowsiness of the previous night's leave, writing letters to sweethearts in Kansas and Ohio, or preparing for church services, completely unaware that 3,000 miles to the northwest, a radio silence order had just been broken by the crackle of a command that would ignite the globe. To understand the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe that was about to unfold, one must look beyond the explosions and understand the silence that preceded them, a silence that was carefully manufactured by the Kido Butai, the first air fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had been sailing through the rough, freezing waters of the North Pacific for weeks, completely undetected, a ghost fleet of 6 aircraft carriers moving under the cover of storms and strict radio silence, led by Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, a man who was terrified of the gamble he was taking. The Japanese strategists knew that they could not win a long war against the industrial might of the United States, so they had decided to bet the entire fate of their empire on a single knockout blow, a strike so devastating that it would shatter American morale and allow Japan to conquer Southeast Asia before the United States could even wipe the blood from its eyes. While the American sailors were finishing their breakfasts, miles above them, the sky was already filling with the drone of engines as the first wave of 183 aircraft clawed their way into the air from the heaving decks of the Japanese carriers, a swarm of mechanical wasps carrying armor-piercing bombs made from modified battleship shells and specially designed wooden fin torpedoes built to run shallow in the waters of the harbor. Leading this swarm was Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, a man with a singular focus, who looked down through the breaking clouds and saw the island of Oahu lying naked and defenseless below him, realizing with a mix of exhilaration and disbelief that they had achieved total surprise, that the Americans were indeed asleep, and at 7:49 a.m., he broke radio silence to shout the code words, "Tora! Tora! Tora! Tiger! Tiger! Tiger!" signaling to his fleet that the surprise was complete. Back on the ground, the first sign of the apocalypse wasn't an explosion, but a confusion, a strange sight that didn't register in the brains of the men watching it because it was simply too impossible to believe, like the radar operators at the Opana Point station who had seen a massive blip on their screen minutes earlier, a blip larger than anything they had ever seen, only to be told by a lieutenant at the information center not to worry about it, that it was likely just a flight of American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland, a tragic assumption that would cost thousands of lives. It was only when the first dive bombers tipped their wings and began their screaming descent toward the hangars of Hickam Field and Wheeler Army Airfield that the reality began to set in, not as a realization of war, but as a realization of a mistake, with men looking up and thinking the Navy was running a drill on a Sunday morning, wondering why the pilots were flying so aggressively, until the red circles on the wings, the rising sun insignia, became visible and the earth began to tear apart. The sound came next, a deafening, gut-wrenching cacophony of engines whining at maximum RPM, the whistle of falling bombs, and the thudding crunch of torpedoes hitting the water and burrowing into the mud before detonating against the steel hulls of the battleships. On the USS Oklahoma, the torpedoes struck with such ferocity and speed that the massive ship began to capsize almost immediately, trapping hundreds of men in the darkness of the lower decks as the water rushed in, turning corridors into tombs and leaving sailors to claw at the steel plates in pitch blackness while the ship rolled over, burying them alive in a watery grave while their shipmates on the surface jumped into waters that were rapidly becoming coated with thick, black fuel oil that would soon catch fire. But the centerpiece of the tragedy, the moment that would scar the soul of a nation, was taking place on the USS Arizona, where a high-altitude bomber dropped a single armor-piercing bomb that fell with terrifying precision, piercing through the armored deck near turret number 2 and penetrating deep into the ship's forward magazine, the place where tons of gunpowder and ammunition were stored. The resulting explosion was not just a blast, it was a cataclysm, a volcanic eruption of steel and fire that actually lifted the 30,000-ton battleship out of the water, vaporizing over 1,000 men in a fraction of a second, tearing the ship in half and sending a fireball 500 feet into the air that was so hot it seared the skin of men on ships hundreds of yards away. In Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away from the smoke and the screams, another kind of battle was taking place. A battle of suits and telegrams, where Japanese diplomats Kichisaburo Nomura and Saburo Kurusu were frantically trying to decode a message from Tokyo, a message that was supposed to be a declaration of war delivered 30 minutes before the attack began, intended to preserve Japan's honor and adhere to the rules of war. But the message was too long, the typing took too long, and the bureaucracy of the embassy was too slow, meaning that while the Arizona was burning and American sailors were dying in the oil-slicked waters, the Japanese diplomats were still sitting in the waiting room of Secretary of State Cordell Hull, unaware that their country had already launched a sneak attack, turning them unwittingly into the faces of deceit and treachery. When they finally presented the document to Hull, the attack was already raging, and the Secretary of State, his face white with fury, looked at them and delivered a blistering condemnation, telling them that in all his years of public service he had never seen a document more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions, dismissing them with a coldness that marked the end of diplomacy and the beginning of annihilation. Back in the harbor, the horror was evolving into heroism as men who had been ordinary mechanics and cooks just minutes before transformed into warriors, manning anti-aircraft guns on tilting decks, firing back at the swirling Zeros with anything they could find, pulling their burned comrades out of the flaming water even as the skin peeled from their hands. At the Naval Hospital, the scene was a chaotic nightmare of blood and morphine, with doctors and nurses working in a frenzy to treat horrific burn victims. Men who were black with oil and red with blood, laying in the corridors because the wards were full, quietly asking for water or asking if they were going to die, while outside the windows the black smoke of the dying fleet blotted out the Hawaiian sun, turning the tropical day into a twilight of ash and soot. The second wave of Japanese planes arrived an hour later, intending to finish off what the first wave had started, targeting the dry docks and the remaining ships. But by now the element of surprise was gone and the sky was filled with the flak of American guns, a curtain of black puffs that forced the Japanese pilots to alter their aim, making this second strike less effective but no less terrifying for the men on the ground who were already exhausted, wounded, and traumatized. Yet, amidst the destruction, the Japanese made a critical error, a strategic oversight that would eventually doom their empire. In their focus on the battleships, the symbols of naval power, they ignored the massive oil storage tanks and the dry dock repair facilities, leaving the infrastructure intact that would allow the United States Navy to rise from the ashes like a phoenix, and crucially, the American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were not in the harbor. That morning, having been out at sea on maneuvers, a stroke of luck that meant the most important weapons of the future war had survived. By the time the last Japanese plane turned north to return to the carriers, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more terrible than the silence of the morning, the devastation was absolute. For battleships sunk, others damaged, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and 2,403 Americans dead, their bodies scattered across the burning airfield and trapped in the sunken hulls. But the psychological impact was even greater, for the attack had done exactly the opposite of what Japan intended. Instead of demoralizing the United States into submission, it had filled the American people with a cold, terrible resolve, a unity of purpose that swept away years of isolationism and political division in a single afternoon. The sleeping giant had not been slain. It had been awakened, and it was filled with a terrible resolve. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress, supporting himself on his braces, and delivered the speech that would define the century. His voice steady but heavy with emotion as he declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy, asking for a declaration of war that was granted with a roaring approval, setting into motion the greatest industrial and military mobilization in human history. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor is not just in the loss of life, but in the hubris of empire, the belief that a sudden, violent strike could break the spirit of a free people, a miscalculation that would lead to years of brutal island hopping, kamikaze attacks, and firebombing, eventually ending in the atomic flashes over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is a story of how the world can change in 90 minutes, how the tranquility of a Sunday morning can be shattered by the ambitions of distant leaders, and how ordinary young men, caught in the gears of history, paid the ultimate price for a war they didn't start but were forced to finish. Even today, if you look down into the waters of Pearl Harbor, you can still see the rusting hull of the USS Arizona just beneath the surface, a tomb for hundreds of men who are still on duty, and you can still see the slick of oil that leaks from the wreckage, the black tears of the Arizona. rising to the surface one drop at a time, a persistent, ghostly reminder of the day the sky fell, a warning from the past that vigilance is the price of liberty and that peace, no matter how beautiful the morning, is fragile enough to be broken by the sound of a single engine in the distance. The attack was a tactical masterpiece but a strategic suicide, a moment where the samurai drew his sword only to realize too late that he had struck a glacier, initiating a conflict that would reshape the geopolitical map of the world and turn the United States into a superpower, proving that while you can destroy ships and